In the summer of 1940, Britain faced a strategic situation unlike any it had confronted before. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped destruction at Dunkirk, but it had abandoned nearly all of its heavy equipment. The British Army was no longer capable of resisting a cross-channel invasion in the short term. Britain's survival now rested on the English Channel, the Royal Navy, and most critically, the Royal Air Force. Across the Channel, Germany confronted a different problem. For the first time since the outbreak of the war, the Wehrmacht had achieved decisive victory on land but lacked a clear path forward. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, existed more as a conceptual outline than an executable operation. The German army could not cross the Channel unless the Royal Navy was neutralized. The Royal Navy could not be neutralized unless the Luftwaffe achieved air superiority. And air superiority, German planners believed, could be achieved independently, through air power alone. This belief did not emerge suddenly in 1940. It was the product of 2 decades of interwar air power theory, reinforced by selective wartime experience. Across Europe, military theorists had argued that future wars would be decided not at the front lines but in the enemy's rear. Strategic bombing, they believed, would bypass armies entirely, collapsing states by destroying industrial capacity, communications networks, and civilian morale. The airplane promised a direct path to victory, one unencumbered by trench lines, fortifications, or attritional ground combat. German air doctrine absorbed these ideas but filtered them through its own institutional priorities. The Luftwaffe had been built as a force for operational decision, not strategic endurance. Its aircraft emphasized range sufficient for continental operations, bomb loads optimized for battlefield and interdiction roles, and close coordination with ground forces. Nevertheless, by 1940, Luftwaffe leadership believed that concentrated aerial assault could force Britain into submission without a prolonged campaign. This assumption rested on 3 interlocking beliefs. First, German planners believed that Britain's civilian population was psychologically fragile. The memory of Zeppelin raids during the First World War, combined with contemporary theories of morale collapse, suggested that sustained bombing of cities would break public will. Civil defense measures, they assumed, could delay panic but not prevent it. Once fear spread faster than the state could control it, political pressure would force Britain to negotiate. Second, German doctrine assumed that Britain's command infrastructure was brittle. Destroy airfields, communications hubs, and administrative centers, and the British state would lose the ability to coordinate defense. Fighter units would be isolated. Repair efforts would lag behind destruction. Command and control would fracture under pressure. What mattered was not total destruction, but systemic overload. Third, and most important, German planners believed that air superiority was a prerequisite that could be achieved quickly, and then exploited indefinitely. Once the RAF's fighter force was destroyed or suppressed, the Luftwaffe would operate freely. Losses would decline. Bombing accuracy would improve. The balance of attrition would shift decisively in Germany's favor. These assumptions shaped every subsequent decision. The Luftwaffe did not prepare for a prolonged contest of industrial production. It did not plan for sustained aircraft replacement under heavy losses. It did not design its campaign to adapt dynamically to enemy resilience. Instead, it planned for a short, violent air offensive that would resolve the problem of Britain within weeks. On paper, this seemed reasonable. Germany entered the Battle of Britain with numerical advantages in aircraft and crews. Its pilots were battle-hardened from Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. British fighter strength appeared limited, its aircraft concentrated in the south, its airfields within easy reach of German bombers. British radar, though detected, was poorly understood. German intelligence assessed fighter command as a static force, tied to fixed bases and predictable response patterns. These assessments reinforced the belief that Britain's defenses would crumble under pressure. What German planners did not fully appreciate was that they were not confronting an air force in isolation. They were confronting a system. Britain had spent the late 1930s building an integrated air defense network unlike anything else in the world. This system did not rely on numerical superiority. It relied on information efficiency. Radar stations provided early warning. Filter rooms processed raw data into usable intelligence. Sector stations directed fighters only where needed. Aircraft were conserved, not expended blindly. Pilots were rotated, not burned out in constant patrols. This network allowed Britain to do something German doctrine did not anticipate: fight selectively. Rather than contesting every raid, the RAF could choose when and where to engage. Rather than maintaining continuous air cover, it could surge force at decisive moments. Losses could be absorbed because the system prioritized preservation over constant presence. Yet in 1940, this system was largely invisible to German planners. It did not conform to prevailing air power theory. It did not rely on offensive action. It did not seek decisive battles in the air. Instead, it sought to deny the enemy the conditions required for victory. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was structured around assumptions of offensive dominance. Its command culture emphasized initiative, aggression, and rapid results. Feedback mechanisms existed, but they were oriented toward tactical refinement, not strategic reassessment. When operations failed to produce expected outcomes, the default response was escalation, not reevaluation. This mismatch between expectation and reality would define the Battle of Britain. The opening phase of the air campaign focused on shipping and coastal targets, then shifted toward airfields and radar installations. Losses mounted on both sides, but not asymmetrically enough to confirm German assumptions. British morale did not collapse. Fighter command continued to function. Aircraft losses were replaced faster than anticipated. Radar stations, though damaged, were repaired quickly. Each of these developments contradicted German expectations, but none triggered fundamental doctrinal revision. Instead, planners concluded that they had not applied sufficient pressure. This conclusion led directly to the next phase of the campaign: intensified attacks on infrastructure, cities, and civilian targets. The logic was straightforward. If the system had not yet collapsed, it was because it had not yet been fully tested. Greater force would yield decisive results. By late summer 1940, the Luftwaffe was committed to a strategy whose success depended on assumptions that were already proving false. By September 1940, it was no longer a question of whether air power could reach Britain. It was a question of whether air power alone could impose strategic paralysis on a state whose defenses were designed to absorb, adapt, and endure. By that point, the foundational assumption behind the German air campaign, that concentrated bombing could collapse Britain faster than Britain could adapt, had stopped being true. The failure of German air power in the Battle of Britain did not occur at a single moment, nor did it result from a single catastrophic decision. It emerged through accumulation. Small inaccuracies compounded. Incorrect assumptions interacted with operational friction. Over time, the Luftwaffe's theoretical advantages were neutralized not by dramatic defeat, but by systemic resistance. The critical phase began in earnest in August 1940. On August 13, designated Adlertag, Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe initiated large-scale attacks intended to cripple the Royal Air Force decisively. The objective was explicit: force fighter command into battle, destroy its aircraft in the air and on the ground, and open the path to air superiority. Hundreds of bombers and fighters were committed across multiple axes, targeting airfields, radar sites, and aircraft production facilities. The results were mixed from the outset. German formations encountered British fighters more frequently than expected. Radar warning provided sufficient notice for interceptions, even when attacks were dispersed or launched under cover of cloud. Losses mounted, particularly among bombers operating at the edge of fighter escort range. While some British airfields sustained damage, few were rendered inoperable for more than short periods. Crucially, German intelligence misread the damage inflicted. Reports emphasized visible destruction, burning hangars, craters on runways, damaged buildings. What they did not capture was operational continuity. Fighter squadrons were relocated temporarily, not destroyed. Maintenance crews worked around the clock. Aircraft were dispersed rather than concentrated. Sortie rates dipped briefly, then recovered. From the German perspective, the indicators were ambiguous but encouraging enough to continue. Fighter command was assumed to be under severe strain. Loss figures appeared comparable. Pressure was maintained. As the weeks progressed, however, the nature of the contest began to diverge sharply from German expectations. The Luftwaffe had anticipated that sustained pressure would force British fighters into constant engagement, producing exhaustion and attrition. Instead, British commanders rationed combat. Fighters were committed selectively, often in small groups, designed to disrupt bomber formations rather than seek annihilation. Engagements were short. Pilots returned to base, refueled, rearmed, and flew again. German pilots, by contrast, faced longer transit times, particularly fighter escorts tethered to bombers. Once fuel limits were reached, escorts had to disengage, leaving bombers vulnerable during withdrawal. Losses occurred not only during attacks but during egress, when formations were fragmented and fuel was low. These losses were not catastrophic individually, but they were persistent. By mid-August, Luftwaffe units were flying at a tempo that strained maintenance capacity. Aircraft availability declined. Pilot fatigue increased. Replacement crews lacked the experience of those they replaced. The Luftwaffe's training pipeline, designed for pre-war conditions, could not replenish losses at the rate required by sustained operations. Meanwhile, British Fighter Command absorbed damage unevenly, but deliberately. The most heavily attacked airfields were often sector stations in the southeast. While these installations were vital, they were not single points of failure. When damaged, command functions were degraded but not eliminated. Control could be exercised at lower levels. Communication lines were rerouted. Operational improvisation compensated for physical damage. What commanders did not yet understand was that German pressure was increasingly misdirected. German intelligence assessments underestimated the importance of sector stations relative to forward airfields and overestimated the effect of visible damage. As a result, attacks shifted erratically between targets. Radar installations were struck intermittently, then ignored. Fighter bases were bombed, then deprioritized. Production facilities were targeted without sustained focus. This inconsistency prevented cumulative effects. At no point did the Luftwaffe maintain sufficient pressure on a single critical node long enough to force systemic collapse. Instead, it spread effort across too many objectives, each of which could absorb limited damage without failing. The turning point in operational logic came in early September 1940. Following a series of navigational errors and retaliatory dynamics, German leadership authorized large-scale attacks on London and other major cities. The rationale was strategic. Civilian morale and political will were now the primary targets. The expectation was that urban bombardment would force Britain to divert fighter resources away from airfield defense, opening opportunities to destroy remaining RAF strength. The consequences were the opposite of what German planners intended. By shifting focus away from fighter command infrastructure, the Luftwaffe relieved pressure on the very system it needed to destroy. British airfields recovered. Squadron rotation stabilized. Aircraft repair and replacement rates improved. Pilots gained experience rather than being worn down. The air battle over London did draw large fighter engagements, but these occurred under conditions favorable to the defenders. British fighters operated near their bases, with short transit times and full radar support. German fighters again faced range limitations. Bomber losses increased. At this stage, the campaign entered an irreversible phase. The Luftwaffe could no longer achieve air superiority without losses exceeding its replacement capacity. Each large raid produced diminishing returns. Bomb damage inflicted pain but not paralysis. British morale did not collapse, it consolidated. Command and control remained intact. Industrial output continued. The decisive factor was not a single engagement, but the loss of strategic leverage. Air power theory had assumed that offensive pressure would degrade the defender faster than the attacker. In reality, the opposite occurred. British defenses improved under stress. German offensive capability eroded with each sortie. By late September, German commanders faced a dilemma. To continue daylight operations meant unacceptable losses. To reduce intensity meant abandoning the objective of air superiority. The solution was a shift to night bombing, a tacit acknowledgement that control of the air had not been achieved. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. At the moment this decision was made, the outcome of the Battle of Britain was already determined, not because Britain had achieved decisive victory in the air, but because Germany had failed to achieve the conditions required for invasion. Air superiority had not been secured. Naval superiority remained unattainable. Strategic paralysis had not occurred. The Luftwaffe had entered the campaign believing that concentrated air power could collapse a modern industrial state. It exited having demonstrated the limits of that belief. If you find this kind of forgotten military history as compelling as we do, we'd be honored if you'd consider subscribing. These stories matter because they explain not just what happened, but why. The failure was now structural, not tactical. No change in targets or tactics could reverse the underlying imbalance between offensive sustainability and defensive resilience. The system had been tested repeatedly, and each test had produced the same result. German air power could inflict damage. It could not impose decision. The immediate consequence of the Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority was operational paralysis at the strategic level. Germany had not lost the war in 1940, but it had lost the initiative. What had been conceived as a short, decisive campaign instead produced a prolonged stalemate, one that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the conflict. The postponement of Operation Sea Lion was the most visible outcome, but it was not the most important. The deeper consequences lay in how German leadership interpreted the results of the air campaign and what they failed to understand. From Berlin's perspective, the Battle of Britain had not ended in catastrophic defeat. British cities were burning. Civilian casualties were rising. Night bombing appeared to offer a means of continuing pressure without prohibitive losses. The Luftwaffe still existed as a formidable force. These facts obscured the structural reality. Germany had failed at the only task that mattered in 1940, eliminating Britain as an active belligerent. Because this failure was not framed as decisive, it did not produce doctrinal reckoning. German leadership concluded that air power had been insufficiently decisive on its own, not that its underlying assumptions were flawed. The lesson drawn was not that strategic bombing theory had limits, but that it required either greater scale or complementary action elsewhere. This interpretation directly shaped subsequent strategic decisions. Unable to force Britain out of the war, Germany turned east. The decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941 was influenced by many factors, but the unresolved conflict with Britain played a critical role. Britain remained a base for future Allied operations, a source of strategic pressure, and a symbol of resistance. Rather than solving this problem directly, German leadership sought to render it irrelevant by destroying the Soviet Union, thereby securing continental dominance. What commanders did not yet understand was that the Battle of Britain had already imposed constraints that would shape every future campaign. The Luftwaffe entered the Eastern Front without having recovered from its 1940 losses. Aircraft inventories were depleted. Pilot experience levels were uneven. Training pipelines had been disrupted by the demands of sustained combat. The force remained tactically effective, but it lacked the depth required for prolonged, multi-theater warfare. Meanwhile, Britain adapted. Freed from the immediate threat of invasion, British planners could shift from survival to recovery. Aircraft production expanded rapidly. Fighter command refined its doctrine. Radar coverage improved. Night fighting capabilities developed. Bomber command, though still imperfect, began to grow into a strategic instrument of its own. Perhaps most importantly, Britain remained in the war long enough for external dynamics to change. The Battle of Britain preserved Britain as a platform for alliance. American material support increased steadily. Intelligence cooperation deepened. Industrial integration expanded. None of this would have been possible if German air power had succeeded in 1940. At the operational level, the consequences of the air battle were subtle but profound. German night bombing campaigns inflicted damage but failed to achieve strategic decision. Without air superiority, bombing accuracy declined. Industrial dispersal mitigated losses. Civil defense reduced casualties relative to expectations. The bombing campaign became a war of endurance rather than collapse, a contest Germany was not structurally equipped to win. British air defenses, by contrast, continued to improve. The system that had survived the test of 1940 became the foundation for layered air defense throughout the war. Radar integration expanded. Command and control procedures were formalized. Fighter interception doctrine evolved in response to new threats. The asymmetry widened over time. The full impact of the Battle of Britain would only become clear later, when Germany faced a multi-front war against opponents whose industrial capacity, alliance networks, and technological integration far exceeded its own. In retrospect, the failure to defeat Britain in 1940 transformed what might have been a limited continental conflict into a global war of attrition. Yet even in hindsight, it is important to note what did not happen. The Luftwaffe was not destroyed. German pilots did not suddenly become ineffective. Tactical innovation continued. At the local level, German air units remained dangerous throughout the war. The failure was not one of competence, but of strategic miscalculation. Air power had been asked to do something it could not do alone. It was asked to produce political collapse without sustained control of the air. It was asked to break a system designed specifically to absorb pressure. It was asked to compensate for the absence of naval and amphibious capability. These were tasks beyond its institutional design. The consequence was strategic delay, and strategic delay favored Britain. Every month that Britain remained in the war altered the balance of power. Resources accumulated. Alliances solidified. German advantages eroded relative to the scale of the conflict. The inability to force a decision in 1940 meant that Germany would now have to fight under progressively less favorable conditions. The Battle of Britain, therefore, was not merely a defensive success. It was a strategic inflection point. It demonstrated that modern states equipped with integrated defense systems could resist concentrated air attack long enough to change the broader strategic equation. Germany did not lose the war in the skies over southern England, but it lost the opportunity to win it quickly. The enduring lesson of the Battle of Britain lies not in tactical performance, nor in individual brilliance, but in the exposure of air power theory when tested against a resilient, system-based defense. What failed in 1940 was not courage or competence. What failed was an assumption about how modern states collapse. Interwar air power theory had promised decisiveness. By bypassing armies and striking directly at the heart of a society, strategic bombing was expected to render prolonged war obsolete. Civilian morale would break, command structures would fail, industrial output would cease, political authority would fracture under pressure. These ideas were influential not because they were irrational, but because they aligned with technological optimism and the traumatic memory of attritional warfare. The Battle of Britain demonstrated that these assumptions were incomplete. Britain did not respond to air attack as a fragile organism. It responded as a network. Damage to one node did not paralyze the system. Instead, functions shifted, compensated, and adapted. Radar stations were repaired. Command authority was redistributed. Airfields were abandoned temporarily and reused later. Civilian morale, rather than collapsing, adjusted to sustained threat. This adaptability undermined the core premise of strategic paralysis. Air power could impose costs. It could force resource allocation. It could inflict suffering. But it could not, on its own, compel political decision against a state that retained functional control mechanisms and the means to learn under pressure. A second lesson concerns sustainability. The Luftwaffe entered the campaign optimized for operational shock, not strategic endurance. Its force structure, training pipeline, and logistics system assumed short campaigns with rapid resolution. When confronted with a defender designed to trade space for time and efficiency for survival, those assumptions became liabilities. Losses that were acceptable in a short campaign became prohibitive over months. Pilot experience eroded faster than it could be replaced. Aircraft availability declined under continuous strain. Command decisions were forced by attrition rather than choice. Air superiority, the prerequisite for every subsequent German objective, proved impossible to sustain without an industrial and institutional base designed for prolonged contest. A third lesson lies in feedback and adaptation. British air defense was not perfect in 1940. It was incomplete, stressed, and frequently improvised. Its strength lay not in initial perfection, but in its capacity to learn faster than the attacker. Each engagement refined procedures. Each failure produced adjustment. Information flowed upward and downward with sufficient speed to correct errors before they became fatal. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, operated within a doctrinal framework that expected rapid validation. When expected outcomes failed to appear, the response was escalation rather than reassessment. Because air power theory predicted collapse, resistance was interpreted as insufficient pressure, not flawed logic. This asymmetry in learning rates proved decisive. The Battle of Britain thus revealed a fundamental limitation of air power as it was conceived in the early 20th century. Air forces could shape wars. They could influence outcomes. They could enable or deny operations. But they could not reliably substitute for control of territory, sea lanes, or political institutions. Without control, destruction alone did not translate into decision. This lesson was not fully absorbed in 1940, nor was it universally accepted later. Strategic bombing campaigns would continue throughout the war, often with far greater scale and technological sophistication. Yet even then, decisive results required integration with ground and naval operations. Air power alone remained insufficient to force surrender against determined, adaptive opponents. The Battle of Britain mattered because it occurred early, before alliances hardened, before industrial mobilization reached full scale, before the war became global. It was the first large-scale confrontation between air power theory and a modern integrated defense system. The outcome did not invalidate air power. It defined its limits. Those limits remain relevant. Modern warfare continues to emphasize speed, reach, and precision. Networks have replaced individual platforms as the decisive unit of analysis. Yet the core question persists. Can technological superiority compel decision against systems designed for resilience? The Battle of Britain suggests caution. Victory is not achieved by striking hardest, but by degrading the opponent's capacity to function faster than one's own capacity erodes. Systems that prioritize endurance, adaptability, and information efficiency can outlast forces optimized for shock. When that happens, time becomes the decisive weapon. In 1940, Britain did not win by destroying the Luftwaffe. It won by surviving it. Germany did not lose because it lacked aircraft or skill. It lost because its theory of decision could not overcome a defense built to resist collapse. That is why the Battle of Britain was not merely a contest of aircraft over southern England. It was a confrontation between two ideas of how wars are decided. One promised speed and inevitability. The other promised delay and resilience. Only one of those ideas proved durable. And in that durability lay the true outcome of the battle.